Hello, everyone. I am Asha Dore, and this is Totally Biased Reviews for Parley Lit.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to see you.
I am so happy to see you too. Well, I should probably ask you to introduce yourself so that we can start to talk about your amazing book.
My name is Temim. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I am a queer, non-binary, anti-Zionist Jew. I get into a lot of mischief here in Brooklyn, and I write about a lot about Jewish and queer topics. I write a lot about desire, about families, about food. Um, and I like writing that sort of exists in a place that straddles this world and some other.
I just I love your voice so much and I love your book so much. The person who did the audiobook is lovely. It's really wonderful. It's so like
Yeah.
beautifully done.
She
But yeah,
she's Matilda. I don't know if you caught that from the 90s movie
oh,
Matilda. Yeah. So I was
amazing.
like doubly excited, but she did an incredible job. So I was very
Wow.
happy with it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's so cool. Oh yeah, I like that. And I one of my favorite parts of your book is just this idea of wanting moving through generations. I think that's just so there's so much to think about inside of that. I think that's so wonderful. Um,
Thank you. Yeah, really, I think about it a lot too.
yeah, yeah. So we are here to talk about City of Laughter, which is your beautiful new book. The cover is so beautiful too. I just love everything about it. Um, would you like to blurb your book or talk about, what's are some of the hearts of your book?
So I call my book Speculative Queer History of an Eastern European Jewish Family. It's basically a book that spans four generations of Jewish women in this one particular family who are sort of bound by blood and by a lot of things, but also by encounters with a shape-shifting stranger over the course of 100 years. Um, and the book moves from the suburbs of Maryland to Brooklyn, New York, to Warsaw and Rupchitz in Poland, and it sort of zigzags through time from the 18th century to the present, and also sort of intersperses narrative sections with other frequencies, epistolary sections, and snippets of Jewish folklore, both real and invented.
Yeah, I love the folklore, of course. I mean, it's such a big part of the book, but it's so wonderful. I usually am reading a couple of books at the same time, and I happened to be reading this while I was listening to A View from the Cheap Seats. It's Neil Gaiman's collection of introductions and essays and stuff. And so it was so
Mhm.
interesting to like hear him talk about like, the craft of writing fantasy and folklore and stuff, and also be listening to and reading your book. Really cool like intersections and just
That's
so many beautiful
amazing.
stories.
Honored to sit next to Neil Gaiman, even on your bedside table.
But do you have any favorite folk tales from your book?
I think I'm partial to the section about mirrors. I love all the folk tales. A lot of them really are invented. They are sort of remixing tropes and almost like broad impressionistic strokes from the stories I grew up with. But the mirror, if you haven't read the book, there is a section where one of the characters has heard this kind of, it's kind of a folk tale. It's also like Jewish urban suburban lore that there's this elaborate ritual you can do at the stroke of midnight on your 16th birthday while looking in the mirror, which will reveal the identity of your future husband at the cost of 2 years of that husband's life. And the reason I'm partial to that is because that is actually something that I have a terrible memory, but it's some version of that was something that I heard when I was in Orthodox Jewish school. and it haunted me. And mirrors have always fascinated me. And I know in secular ghost stories and in ghost stories from all traditions and folk tales from all traditions, mirrors seem to figure prominently in so many of them. But I was just always so tickled by this idea that you cover the mirror when, in Jewish tradition, when somebody dies, and that when you uncover the mirror, I was always just very taken by this idea that there was more in the mirror that I couldn't see.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that section so much. My haunt was Bloody Mary growing up.
Uh-huh.
I'm writing a book right now about me and my mother, and there's like a whole middle of the book is kind of about Bloody Mary and just like what is happening in her world and
Wait,
like
that's
the horror of that.
amazing. Yeah, that haunted me too for similar reasons. I love that.
Yeah. It's very, and it's still, I still have a little bit of trouble with bathroom mirrors in the dark sometimes. Like if I get up in the middle of the night, I'm like, I should just keep the light off. I'm going to be fine. Like it's, I'm 37.
Hard
It's
thing.
never going to end. Yeah. Um, but I thought that was so interesting and really beautiful, but also a little touch of horror. I really also enjoy how your book, moves around grief and death, the many layers of that, the hinge between joy and a little bit of terror that I felt as I was, reading about the deaths in the book and the ideas of the hauntings and the ghosts and the unknowable histories.
I think the mirror is sort of emblematic of that hinge to me because of what I was saying about how, you cover it when somebody's died. And I think, part of that is like maybe you don't need at that moment to be concerned with how you look or those sort of worldly concerns. But at the same time, I always thought, what are we keeping out or what are we keeping in by covering mirrors? And I do think there is this evocation that there's some in-between space and that a mirror can be emblematic of that. And I think that
Yeah.
hinge is like a really important space in the story.
Well, you talked a little bit already about the way that you organize the book. Do you have anything else that you want to say about that? Is there anything that was challenging for you or that you played with?
The book sort of happened iteratively. Like I started with the more linear narrative sections, but I knew early on that I wanted them to be sort of interrupted by other frequencies. And I do think about them like frequencies. Like I think about I want the experience of reading the book to almost feel like driving, and at different places the radio gets different different qualities of reception, right? So like different frequencies come in at different times. Threading together these different pieces where I wanted the seams to be apparent, but I didn't want it to be like a jerky reading experience in a bad, distracting way was like pretty challenging, I think, just to figure out the right balance. And I hope that I did. I wanted it to feel polyvocal too. So I wanted, inanimate things and animals to sort of take part in the narration as well. And for there to be an experience of like almost the choral for the reader. I mean, it was all challenging because it was my first novel. And I think writing a novel is one of the hardest things I've ever done. But bringing that all together was a fun and sometimes difficult challenge. I think too, a friend of mine and I talked early when I was drafting the book about this fantasy that, at least I've always had of this like box of letters in some attic that contains like the full contents of a love affair between two, an ancestor of mine and somebody else. Those artifacts that so many of us will never discover and probably don't even exist. But the sort of fantasy of that box of letters has sort of followed me through writing this book. And so the epistolary sections specifically were meant to sort of let the reader have that fantasy with me of the box of letters without necessarily giving all of the characters access to those letters.
I love this. It's almost like I'm getting a little bit of satisfaction of my own vicariously through these characters, and also like the tension of them not getting access to the letters and me knowing was really satisfying. I listened to it before I read it, which is always an interesting thing to me. I just could get access to the audiobook first, so that's where I went. And so it was, the transitions for me were just so smooth. And then going back through and reading it, I'm having the same experience, but it's like nice because I get to spend more time with the language. It's an interesting thing living in a world where we can listen to a book before we read it. So it's almost like a performance that we're getting on top of the work, so interesting. But
Yeah.
I think that the frequency while driving, I can like feel that in my body, that is totally what it's like to read your book. So by the way, just as a side note, Annie Gudger's Totally Biased review is coming out soon for her book, that she put out a few months ago. And I
Yeah.
just think it's so cool that we have like this cohort from. Why do you think people should read your book?
I think something that comes up a lot for me in conversations with other writers and artists and people who are not writers or artists is this idea of, what I'm calling speculative history, and I think what other people call that, but still other people might call something else, is just rooted in the fact that for many reasons, so the sort of like colonial realities we live in, and because of, genocide and because of erasure, a lot of people just don't have access to full family histories. And then I think there's another way in which sometimes families are just forgetful. Even if you do have access to this sort of quote unquote archive of your family, I don't know, no one in my family has a very good memory. So, you ask someone something about somebody who's died and they're like, I think it was this, but maybe it was this. And so I think just coming from a rich tradition of folklore in, Ashkenazi Judaism, and being a queer person who's really, I'm really rooted in this idea of like sort of queer possibility and what kinds of magic queerness can make possible that, a sort of a heteronormative world doesn't allow itself to imagine. Um, those two resources felt really rich for me in like speculating my history. And in speculating a history that I don't in any way believe is some sort of like empirical truth about my family. I tell this story that my mother was showing me pictures of my grandmother. And as someone who was recently more, moving through the world as a queer femme, I looked at the picture of my grandmother and she just looked so glamorous. And I thought, she almost looks like a contemporary queer femme. And I thought, of course, that's projection. But then I started thinking, what if she had been, there's no way I would know, um, because of the time it was, and just because of what gets lost over the course of time, and because of people wanting to keep things hidden. And so partially I wrote this book to just say, like, this is one way it could have been. There's so many ample ways it could have been. But this is a very long way of saying that I think I want people to read the book because I think a lot of us share this impulse to kind of use the interpretive and creative tools that we have from our own cultures and traditions and families to kind of thread together the disparate pieces of our histories that we can't get through evidence or facts. And I'm so grateful to be a part of, I feel like a class of writers and a generation of writers who have been doing that for a little while already. There are so many good models of like speculative histories and speculative family stories. And so I think, the more I want to be a part of that conversation. And I think that if somebody's already thinking about that and wants another perspective, I think my book is one I might humbly recommend.
For me, it was like really so cool to think like, if there's something that I don't know, I can just kind of imagine it. I can just add a new story and see what that's like. And that's a really interesting way of dealing with identity and loss and all kinds of things. Just so I think that it's so wonderful. And it's interesting that you brought up the picture of your grandmother. My uncle died last February, and I went down for this like big musical memorial because I come from like a musical family. I'm not musical myself. And we were looking at pictures, and my mama was like the most unhappy person ever when I knew her. Angry, and she said hilarious mean things, but they were very mean mostly. And then we found these pictures of her younger and like smiling and all put together and like with these people that we didn't know. And we just sat there thinking about like what her life was before she got like swooped into this, family.
It's incredibly powerful to see that because it's so obvious logically that, people who are older than us who came before us had all these full lives before we came along, but it's so mysterious and so kind of inaccessible sometimes. And while speculation can't replace like, that person's lived experience, I think sometimes it leads you to unexpected kinds of understanding, or at least like better questions.
What do you hope that your reader walks away with?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I would love for people to walk away with is like a sense of permission, whether as a reader and just a person in the world or as a writer, and again, humbly, like my book is just one contribution to like so like a richness that we have right now of books like it. But I think permission to sort of, like I said, speculate, permission to reach back where you might think you might not have the right tools to reach back with. I wanted this book to be a place where theorems of wonder could be proven true. So like sometimes I'm going through my day and something happens and I think that meant something. And we like the world is for good reason often like a more skeptical place than that. And maybe it meant nothing. And, maybe it was just happenstance. But I wanted my book to be a place where if you thought something was meaningful, then it probably meant something. So just maybe curiosity. I think the book was driven for me by like a sort of insatiable curiosity about a bunch of things that I don't think writing the book helped me get any more knowledgeable about necessarily, but I think I went deep into like the caverns of my curiosity in a way that felt really fulfilling.
Yeah, I love that. I wrote down theorems of wonder can be proven true. I think that's one of my favorite like sentences I've ever heard. I think that's really,
You.
really cool. What an invitation. Who would you cast in I would say that this would probably be a series.
I haven't really come up with all of the characters, but I think just in terms of like production, I want to get this into Natasha Lyonne's hands because I think she could do the right thing with it. I think she could do something wild and weird and deeply Jewish and deeply New York, and I would love it. So if anyone knows Natasha Lyonne, I think I want Catherine Hahn to play Hannah, even though she's not Jewish. She's kind of honorary in my mind, and I just think it could be
Mhm.
great. And I was not sure who to cast as Shiva until recently a friend suggested Hannah Einbinder if she could play a little
Mhm.
more sincere than she usually does. And I thought that would be great.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah. Also ER Fight Master, who's like
Mhm.
the non-binary doctor on Grey's Anatomy, which I still loyally watch after 20 seasons, I think could
Same.
play could play Shiva's ex, Danny.
Oh my gosh. Like I think all of those are so correct. Yeah, I love it. And awesome that, fellow Grays
Oh,
person,
I know.
regardless of the quality.
I know it's jumped the shark like 8,000 times, and I'm just like, well, guess I'm committed.
Yeah. Do you want to read a little bit from your book?
Since we talked about that mirror scene, maybe I'll just read a little bit from that.
Cool. Love it.
After Hannah's friends left and Syl went to bed, Hannah opened the freezer and took out the slice of challah she'd hidden there, wrapped in a paper towel. She took it upstairs, slid it under her pillow, and lay uselessly awake, eyes burning with anticipation. One of her windows was open and the bedroom was warm. As she lay, time arched its back. The night stretched out and expanded, shining with the promise of forever, and then shrank into one marble-sized minute. Everything in the velvety galaxy condensed into the thick seconds that turned 11:54 into 11:55 when Hannah's alarm finally sounded. Her body crystallized with fear at the sound. One by one, lining up in her chest, anticipation, preliminary regret, edge of anger, And that sadness, whatever it was that made her mother sad and that had made her mother's mother sad before her, the sadness was the temperature of glass, the size of an eternity of stretched out nights. She steeled herself, embarrassed by the childlike urge she had to run to her mother's room to confess and beg for absolution. She needed to do things differently this time. She sat at the vanity, lit the candle, held the bread to the flame, prayed her mother wouldn't smell the burning from down the hall. Then she waited. In the mirror, she saw herself. Her freckles lit by the blue dark, eyes spooked wide. Her moon-shaped face cut by worry, eyelashes long in the flamelight. It was a simple face, a good face. Nothing to be afraid of. The flame licked the last of the bread, and she shook the ashes off her hand into the wastebasket. Was it ridiculous to believe that she would meet her future husband tonight? If she did, would she tell Lydia or Rachel or Devora about it? If the husband was someone she didn't yet know, she hoped for bright black eyes, kind and curious, nice cheekbones and curly hair to complement her waves. A nightgown strap slipped down one of her shoulders and she adjusted it, realizing she wasn't sure if, when she saw the husband-to-be would also be able to see her. This suddenly felt like important information to have had before starting the ritual. Quickly, candle still in her right hand, she leaned from her chair and reached for the pink blouse draped over the chest at the foot of her bed. Passing the candle from hand to hand, eyes steady on the mirror, she put an arm in each sleeve and buttoned 2 of the buttons. She smoothed her hair, dipped her pinky into the pot of tinted lip gloss on her vanity, and applied some. If there was a chance he would see her, she needed to look ready. 11:59. Hannah blinked. A creak from the hallway, and she held still. She could hear Syl's litany of nevers as though her mother was speaking them directly in her ear. Never walk barefoot on wet grass or eat cake warm from the oven. Never pour someone a drink backhanded or clip fingernails over the floor. Never wear socks in bed or walk shoeless in the home. Never miss a day of prayer. Never throw bread. Never spill the honey or the salt. Never bargain with a mirror. Hannah knew it was on the list somewhere, probably toward the top. Never do anything that might invite an unwelcome spirit. When Hannah asked what unwelcome meant, Syl always said, "You'll know what's unwelcome when it feels like something you shouldn't touch." Midnight. Emboldened by her own follow-through, Hannah touched the mirror with her right hand. It was cool against her fingertips, and the pleasure she felt when she touched it surprised her. She pressed her fingers firmly into the glass and sucked in her breath. A little bit of hot wax dripped onto her finger. She adjusted the candle. If Hannah was powerful enough to invite what she shouldn't, if it might actually come inside, what other power might she uncover? Her mother, she thought, was a coward, and she felt angry at all the cowardice. What was the point of not touching? Touch, and now she stroked the mirror a little bit, coaxing. Felt so good. I can touch this, thought Hannah, though she knew she was still unpracticed. I am not my mother. I could be powerful. It was the first time she'd thought the words and actually begun to believe them. Hannah shifted in her seat, the skin around her wrists and thighs beginning to prickle and sing. She began to feel large, the vanity chair underneath her less consequential. Time opened its maw, yawning, and the dark room grew ocean-wild around her, pouring her into midnight. And then, behind her in the mirror, something rose. Just an indigo blur at first. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again. The blur came into focus. It was a face, a woman's face. Hannah's stomach folded. The details of the woman's features swam in and out of focus in the dark, but the woman was a fact. Her eyes, the clearest part of her, were uncommonly green. Her skin, like sand, seemed of no particular age, and her lips were parted like a question. Hannah hadn't thought about what she would do if a face came into view, so she just held the woman's gaze. Who was this woman? A future Hannah? Hannah's eyes weren't green. Maybe she was related to the husband, the one she had staked her bets on encountering. Had she done the ritual wrong? The woman's shape quivered, and Hannah felt a sharp stab of fear. The candle quivered too. It didn't occur to Hannah, of course, that the woman in the mirror was the one whose life might be cut short by her looking, the one whose green eyes Hannah would only see again decades later.
Yay, thank you. I love
Of
that scene
course,
so
thank
much.
you.